Thank you for everybody for attending. So normally we would have done this in person. Unfortunately, we have been forced because hopefully all of us are staying home and being safe and being healthy, that we've turned this into an online webinar. So if you've been listening to the news over the course of the last couple of months, you know that the 2020 census has really been pushed by us at libraries, by organizations, by the federal government, so that everybody in the United States is counted. And the reason why we do that is because it's actually mandated by federal law. So if you've gone in and you've ever done genealogical research, you know that you have access to the US Census. And I'm going to explain the process behind that and how you can access records and the other types of records that are available besides just federal records. But I do want to talk a little bit about the current census and the type of information that's collected, and I'll do that in just a second. So what we're going to talk about today is we're going to talk about the federal census. We're going to talk about the difference between what they consider the population schedule, which is what we do when we fill out that census online and we submit our responses to the federal government. But then I'll talk a little bit about what some of those non-population schedules were that the government collected. So they collected things like agriculture, industry, mortality, slave schedules. Those types of things were recorded at different times throughout the US history, and they can still be really useful to you in your genealogical research. I'll talk about state and territorial censuses because besides the federal government wanting to know how many people are within the country, each state or territory wanted to know how many residents they had within their state as well so that they could provide services. None of them are ever the same, and I'll show you some examples of those. There are other things that you might not have used. So even if you've been a genealogist for a number of years, you're very familiar with using the federal census or the state census, you might not have known that you also have opportunities to use things like school schedules or school censuses. They used to refer to them as Indian census. We would call them Native American census. And then military census are also out there and available to us to use in our research. And I'm going to give you some examples on how to access each of those types as well. So I work in Plainfield. I work at the Plainfield Public Library, and Plainfield is in the midst of collecting data for 2020, just like the rest of us. So throughout the course of my job as the genealogy and local history librarian, I come across these fun little tidbits from time to time. And one of them was from the 1910 census. And they were reporting about how close they were to predicting the population of the town in 1910. And if you look at the result, 1,019 people was the population in Plainfield in 1910. In 1900, the population was 977. So you could see in small town rural America that the population really only changed by about 24 people over the course of a 10-year period. So sometimes it's interesting to not just look at your particular family or your particular person, but to also get a feel for how large is the community? What is the community makeup? That demographic information can really help you as a genealogist because it lets you know, are they, a small town? Are they a large city? Are they a wealthy town? Are they more of a poorer village? That type of information, what the demographic makeup is, how many people are, African American, how many people were Native American, how many people were Caucasian, how many people, were from overseas or were born in that state. So sometimes looking at the demographic of the census throughout the years can give you a really good idea of who their friends were, who their grocer was, what the people were like in their neighborhood. Sound like a Sesame Street episode for a second there. But it gives you a really good idea of what life was like for your family at that particular time. So back to the US federal census, it's actually constitutionally required that the US does a decennial census, so once every 10 years, of the population of the people within the United States. That is not citizens, that is anybody who is a resident who is living in the United States at any particular time. So it wasn't based just on what their citizenship status was, it was anybody who was in the United States at the time that they were conducting the census. So the very first census was done in 1790. Because of the nature of the United States at that time, it started in August of 1790, but it really didn't complete until May of 1791. At the time that that information was provided back to Congress, there were 4 million Americans who were listed on the 1790 census. And I have a couple of asterisks there, and I'll come back to why I have those asterisks there when I talk about some of the oddities of conducting the US Census. So what the US Census is trying to do right now in 2020 is that exact same thing. It is trying to collect all of the data about the residents within the United States borders from April 1st, which was our go-to start census date, all the way until the mid-August, August 15th of 2020. So you have plenty of time to get your information in. I would be thrilled if you posted in the chat that you had already done your census online and that you've been counted. If you haven't done that yet, what the US Census does is it sent out the postcards first, and it asks you to conduct your census information online. If you have not done that yet, starting next week, they're going to be sending out the paper census, which is what we're more familiar with historically, where you take that paper form and you fill out all the information on it. So you put who's in the household on April 1st, 2020. So if you have people who are coming and going from within your household, you really just want to do an inventory of who was in your household on April 1st, 2020. And when I talk about oddities in the US Census, I'll talk about why it's so important to make sure that you're counting people once, only once, and in the right place, which has been the census motto in 2020, is because from time to time, you might see one person show up 2, sometimes 3 times on a federal census because the census taker came to that person's door in July of 1860, and then they had gone off to work and they were counted again 2 weeks later with their employer. So sometimes you'll see people show up more than once. I'll give you an example of that. But because we do this once every 10 years, that information is used for a number of things. It benefits us as public libraries because it figures out exactly how much funding institutions need, from your road district to the fire department to the library. It helps keep track of how many people are here and how many people need services. So it's really, really, really important that you make sure that you're accounted for in the US Census. As genealogists, we get really excited because we know down the road that our ancestors are going to be able to find us in the US Census, just like we're able to find our parents, our grandparents, and our great-grandparents in the US Census. So it's important that we are continuing that tradition that our family has upheld since 1790. So federal law also requires that that information be sealed for 72 years. That means Homeland Security can't get their hands on it. That means the IRS can't get their hands on it. That means that that information is locked down and is only available to specific people within the US Census Bureau for 72 years. How that impacts us as genealogists is the fact that the 1950 census, which will be the next census to become available, won't be available to us until April of 2022. So every 10 years, just like they conduct the census, they make previous censuses available to the public after that 72-year mark. So one interesting thing that you might not have known was that even if your family shows up in the census 1950, 60, 70, 80, you can petition the Census Bureau to give you a copy of that census entry for your particular family. It's a form that you fill out and they will mail the information to you. The one thing you have to keep in mind about that, though, is you have to give a specific address. So you have to know exactly where that person is in the 1960 census, per se. And then they will only give you that entry. They're not going to give you the page like what you would see currently available for 1940. Sometimes they just give you a single line. So if you had 6 people in a household, you would need to request all 6 people. Otherwise, they're just going to send you the individual line for the person who's the head of household in that particular census year at that address with that name that you provided. So the census can make that available to you, but keep in mind that it's very limited and you're not getting what you would normally get from an open census. So from 1790 all the way up to 1840, what was conducted, what was called a head of household survey. So they would list the name of the person who was the homeowner, and then everybody else was categorized by a series of hash marks. And I'll show you an example of that in just a second. So it would be boys between the age of 0 and 5, 5 and 10, 10 and 15. Girls between the ages of, 0 and 5, 5 and 10, 5 and 15, 10 and 15. It would list things, it would list the, sorry, I apologize, I just lost my train of thought. It would list the family members that are in that household first on the first page, and then on the second page it would be African Americans, it would be everybody else on page 2. So you don't get names, so I don't know who the children are. I don't necessarily know who the people are that are living in the household, whether they're hired hands, whether they're in-laws. I don't have any of that information. All I have are categories of people based on those hash marks. It's not until 1850 that you get what's called the first every name census. So that is, I've got John Smith, I've got Mary Smith, I've got Joseph Smith, Mary Smith and Evangeline Smith, who are the children, listed all by name on that particular census. So between 1790 and 1840, it behooves you to know who the head of household was, because if you only know the children or you only know the spouse or maybe who the hired hand was, it's going to be much more difficult to get into that data. Starting with 1850, you can search on anybody and you're going to be able to find them. Each federal census asks different questions. So for example, in the 1900 census, you're asked how many children have been born to the wife and how many are still living. That was actually a question that was done on the 1890 census, but the 1890 census was so largely destroyed that a lot of people don't mention that. They refer to it in the 1900 census. If you had an opportunity to download the handouts that I had supplied to Amy that went up in the events calendar, you've got a sheet there from the federal government that gives you the listing of what all of the individual questions were throughout the course of the census from 1790 up to 1930. So you have that information as one of the handouts for this particular class. So you can use that at any time to help you in your research. So in 1920, they asked a question on, do you own a radio? So each one is slightly different on what they collect. And you might think, well, why does it matter if my family had a radio in 1920? It's because it goes back to that socioeconomic data that they collect. So like in the 1940 census, they asked, had you been unemployed? Because we were just starting to come out of the Great Depression. So they asked, have you been employed for more than 6 months in the previous year? And they also asked, where were you living 5 years previous? So those are questions that didn't get asked on other census years. So it's important to go and see what the different types of questions are, because it's really important to have that 1900 census. Because to give you an example, my family, Patrick Clark and his wife, Margaret, living on the south side of Chicago, in the 1900 census, Margaret is listed as having had 12 children and only 3 were still living, which was news to me. I discovered that, there were a whole lot of additional children I had to go looking for in order to figure out what happened to 9 of those 12 children that were born to her. So I was able to find baptismal information on 8 out of 9 of them. There was just 1 that I wasn't able to find by using other resources. So that could be a really important question that helps you in your research. If you're familiar with the term the Soundex, our Illinois driver's licenses are based on the Soundex. So like my driver's license, my last name is Beard. So my driver's license number starts with B630. And what that means is they take your name, they drop out all of the vowels, thank goodness, because I have 3 vowels in a row in my name, and it just leaves the consonants remaining. The first consonant, the start of your name, is the first letter, so that's why I have B, and then 6 and 3 are the number equivalents to the R and the D in my name. Because I don't have a third consonant, that's where the 0 comes from. So when you're looking at old records and they mention the Soundex, and they might say that your family's Soundex, your surname Soundex breaks down to 500, it could be because you didn't have enough consonants in your name. It could be, you might have had a name like, John, Jon, as a surname. So you have your J as the start, and then you only have the N. So you wind up with something like 500 in order to create your Soundex code. These work more behind the scenes now than they used to. If you've ever used Ancestry and you've used that little slider between, a general search on the name and the exact spelling of the name, that's really the Soundex working in the background. Or if you've been on familysearch.org and you've done a search and you get your exact spelling of your surname first, maybe the first 10 or 12 entries, and then you start getting names that are similar but not exact, that's using the Soundex in the background. So my maiden name was Tatara, so it brings up Tatara, Tate, Tyler, Taylor, anything that fits into that Soundex code comes up in my search, which can be really, really useful if you have a more uncommon ethnic surname that has a lot of consonants in it. Sometimes that can come in really handy to helping you find people in the census, as well as in other documents on sites like Ancestry or Family Search. So here's an example of one of those head of household censuses. This one's for the city of Joliet from 1840. You can see on the left-hand column, you have all of the names of the heads of households. So we have Reese, we have Doolittle, we have White, and then just a series of hash marks. So we have 2 children two boys between the ages of 5 and 10. We have two boys between the ages of 10 and 15. You know, we have one daughter between the ages of 5 and 10, and two women between the ages of 40 and 50. So it doesn't tell you who they are. It doesn't tell you what the relation to the head of household is. It's just strictly an inventory of all of the people who are living at that address at that time. By this time, they've condensed it down to just a single page. So you have free colored persons in one column, you have free white persons in another set of columns, and then just those hash marks. And then at the bottom, they would keep a running total. So there would be 18 children, 18 boys under the age of 5. You would have 8 girls under the age of 5 for the entire census page for the city of Joliet. Thankfully, that changed over time. Like I said, starting with 1850, they have evolved over the years to ask a series of questions. So by 1940, which is the most current census 100 years after the one I showed you, you see different types of categories, but the same general information. So we have the head of household listed in the column on the left, and then underneath them, the people who are within that household. So you can, see that Leo is listed with his wife Helen, and then you have James listed as a son, you have Daniel listed as a son, you have Alan listed as a son, and then it'll provide you, are they male or female, how old are they, where are they born, are they in school, can they read and write. So those types of information, like I said, can provide a lot of information about your family, but it also provides a lot of that socioeconomic information about your family too. You know, how literate were they at a time when illiteracy might have been high? Were they employed at a time when unemployment might have been high? Where were they born? Where were their parents born? All of those little bits and pieces that'll help fill in pieces to your family history. So some of the issues to the federal census, I was talking a little while ago about how in the 1790 census, which was conducted over 7 months, spilling into 1791, there were 4 million people in the United States at that time. But what's interesting about the 1790 census is that it was woefully incomplete. Because if you look at the list of states, more than half of the states are unaccounted for on that particular census. So there are no census data for Georgia, for Delaware, for Kentucky, for New Jersey, for Tennessee, and for Virginia. So that 4 million count is only about 40% of who was actually living in the United States at that time. I had mentioned earlier that the 1890 census was largely destroyed by fire in 1921. There are only a handful of counties in 10 states and the District of Columbia that survived. In Illinois, the only one that has survived is McDonough County. So if you had family in Illinois and they were living outside of McDonough County, there is no census data available for us for 1890. Give you another example, Hamilton County in Ohio, which is Cincinnati, there's only 2 pages of the 1890 census that survived. So it's only 2 families because it was 1 family per page. So there's only 2 families represented for all of Ohio that survived from the 1890 census. So unfortunately for us, it leaves a huge vacuum in our family history research because the census is only done once every 10 years. So we have 1880 and we have 1900. And if you're not one of those fragments that survived for 1890, then you've got a 20-year gap there between the type of census data that's available for you for researching and tracing your family. The sad thing for us in the US is that the federal census is not conducted on one day. If you've ever done any research in the UK, the federal census for the UK, which would include Wales, which would include Scotland, which would include Ireland, was all done on one night. So you were home, you had to be home. It was required by law that you would be home on the night that the census taker came to your door. And they did a complete count at one time. For us, they did it over a series of months. Typically it was done over the summer, but not always. In 1930, it was done in April. In 1920, to give you an example, is the only year that it was done in winter. And in 1920 in Illinois, there was a terrible blizzard. So the census data for 1920 is really unique in the fact that they were sending people out in the middle of a blizzard in Illinois in below 0 temperatures to go door to door and collect census data. So there are a lot of names that are missing just because of what they were facing with the weather at that particular time. But lucky for me, they did the census in February of 1920 because my great-grandfather is listed on it. He died 4 days later after the census taker came to their door. So if they had done it in April or in June and July, which is when they normally had done it, I wouldn't have had any record of my great-grandfather on that census. So it was a huge breakthrough for me. So I'm grateful that they did it in February of 1920. But because it was done over a series of months, you run into that problem where you have the opportunity for people to be counted more than once. And I'll show you an example of that. So states evolve, states join the Union, states split like Virginia and West Virginia during the Civil War. So states that weren't quite yet states, that were still considered territories at the time of the decennial census, would show up listed as what are called territorial censuses. So you would find a territorial census in 1864, the Dakotas. So you would have South Dakota, North Dakota, you would have Nebraska. That would all be listed as territories. Same thing for Wyoming and Colorado and for Montana. They weren't official states yet, so they still show up listed under territorial census. So as you're doing your research, make sure that you're aware. If you're using Heritage Quest, there's the opportunity to look at the censuses by year, by decade, to see how county boundaries change, to see how state boundaries change, so that you're aware of whether or not you're looking for okay, there we go. Okay, so I talked about the chance of somebody being recorded on the census more than one time. So here's an example of that. So I've got William Murray and his wife Amelia, and then their children, Amelia Murray, William Murray, Emily Murray, Maria Murray. And William Jr. is 16 years old, and he is being accounted for in his father's household in Nausea Township, which is in Kendall County, on June 5th of 1860. William was 16 years old. School had let out. Summer months had begun. He had gone to work on the Caton Farm, Stockyard Farm, which was across the street. Well, they lived right on the county border. So William is counted twice. So he's counted in Kendall County on June 5th, living with mom and dad, and he's 16 years old. A month later, on July 6th, William Murray is recorded again as Junior. So you can see on that page that he's listed as William Murray Jr. He's 17 years old, and he's being recorded in Plainfield Township, in Plainfield in Will County, Illinois. What happened? Why is he listed as 16 on one census and listed as 17 on another? Because he turned 17 at the end of June. So the census is actually accurate. His ages are correct at the time that the census takers came to his door. Yes, technically he was living in two different counties a month apart. So you can see how that can be very confusing when you're doing your research. How do I know I've got the same person? How do I know I've got the right information? So it is very possible for people to be recorded more than once. And it wasn't until you look at a map and you see where the Murray farm is and you see where the Caton Stockyard is, that they are literally less than a quarter of a mile apart. Basically, Junior just walked across the street to go to work every day as a farmhand working for the Caton Stockyards. But if you didn't put those two things together, if you didn't look at, well, where is Nausea Township, where is William Murray's farm, and where is the Caton Stock Farm, then you might not be able to make that connection. Some other little oddities to the census as you're doing your research. Sometimes census takers would write additional notes in the margin. They were not required to do so. Sometimes they just did that for themselves so they can keep track of where they were, or so they could just make notes to themselves. Sometimes you'll get actual addresses. Census doesn't ask, up until 1920, doesn't ask for the address of the property that they're researching, but sometimes census takers would take it upon themselves to put little hash marks and write what street they were on, or they would take it amongst themselves to write the address where they were visiting, especially if you're looking at apartment buildings like in the city of Chicago, and you might have 16 families living in one apartment building. Sometimes that census taker's additional notes to himself can be really, really useful to you, even though it wasn't required as part of the census information collected. Sometimes they'll take the relationships one step farther, so instead of just saying in-law, sometimes they'll give you a little additional information, or if they're a farmhand, they might provide a little bit of extra information about what they're doing for the family. Instead of just saying farmhand, they might say horseshoer or something. Sometimes they would write in the margin length of residency, like just moved in, or, been here 5 years. So it just depends. Sometimes you can get lucky enough for that extra information to be provided. Believe it or not, up to 60% of the time, information on federal census is incorrect. Most often incorrect are ages and names. And when I say names, I don't mean surnames. I just mean names in general. So I'll give you an example. So census taker comes and knocks on the door and dad answers the door. Dads are notoriously less specific about information than moms. Sorry, guys. So a mother would say, oh, who are your children? Well, this is Thomas, this is William, and this is Elizabeth. Dad is more likely to say, you know, this is Billy, this is Tommy, and this is Betsy. So when I say incorrect for ages or for names, it's that type of information that could be mistaken. They might be listed as, you know, Thomas William on the 1860 census, and then on the 1870 census, they might be listed as William Thomas. You know, so that type of information is often incorrect. In ages, a lot of times women, they can lie about their age from time to time. I had one census where the husband was listed as being 34, the wife was 33, and the children were like 16, 15, and 13. And then 10 years later, you know, the husband is 44, the wife is still 33, and the children are now 27, 26, and 13. So sometimes you'll have that happen from time to time, but take it all with a grain of salt. You know, as you're collecting census data, compare them. If in 1860 they're listed as 55, but in 1870 they're listed as 64, why is that? Is it because when the census date came, it was in between birthdays? So you can start to try to figure out the correct information there. Another downside is that a census taker didn't always go back to the home if they didn't answer the first time around. Sometimes they would just ask their neighbors or friends for more information. And the reason why that could be detrimental would be if my neighbors didn't realize that I was born in Texas or Massachusetts, they might tell the census taker that we were all born in Illinois. And that could change our census results when we're doing our searching. Or they might only know the next door neighbor by their nickname. So they might list it as Peggy Smith instead of Margaret Smith, and that gets recorded. So sometimes the information isn't always accurate just simply because the census taker went to the household, nobody answered, and they were relying on the people nearest to them to provide that data. So that's federal population schedules. So those are the, you know, that are done every decade, required by the federal government by law, but also attached to those federal population census schedules are these other non-population schedules. So you see that they did mortality from 1850 to 1880, agriculture, manufacturing and industry. Unfortunately, the vast majority of those did not survive, which is unfortunate because they would have been useful to me in my own research. They listed what they called their defective census, which was 1880 only. So that would be people who were, they list deaf, blind, mute. There's a variety of categories that would have been listed under that defective census schedule, non-population schedule they did in 1880. They had a slave schedule that they did in 1850 and 60, and then a military. And I'll talk about the military one more when I talk about military census at the end. But the way that these worked, where they were separate books that were created at the same time that they were going door to door to collect the population information, they would also have this book as well. So if you were an institution, if you were a poor farm, if you were a hospital, an orphanage, or a jail, a lot of times you'd be recorded at the very end of that particular census count. So for example, the city of Chicago, they would go door to door to all of the households in the city of Chicago, and then they would go to, you know, the Cook County Poor Farm, or they might visit, you know, one of the orphanages or the hospitals, and it would be at the end. But in some other communities, they were done in a completely separate book. Now with an every name census, with our ability to search, it doesn't necessarily matter which book they were recorded in, but just keep in mind that sometimes those would have been separated. They would have been in their own books that would have lived in a different location from the rest of the population schedule. So these books that were dedicated to a particular subject. So let's say they were doing an agricultural census. So what they would ask you is you would get the same information, you would get the head of household, but then you would also get how many acres do they own? How many are actually in production? How many of them are out of production? What types of crops are they growing and in what percentages? What types of animals and livestock do they have? Sometimes it would ask what kind of wagons, what types of farm equipment did they own as well. So this can be really, really important to kind of letting you know, are they really a wealthy, you know, a well-to-do farmer? Are they successful at what they do? Or are they scratch tenant farmers who are barely, barely surviving and making ends meet. So sometimes looking at these extra schedules can be really, really useful to you. Mortality schedule is another one that's going to come in really handy to you in your research as well. I'm going to show you a screenshot of that in just a second. A lot of these have been digitized. They're available through Heritage Quest. They're available through Ancestry and Family Search, but not all of them. So sometimes it's worth to look at the websites for the state archives or the state library where you're doing your research. So I have family in Wisconsin and New York, so I would go to the New York State archives and take a look to see if any of these books exist on the state level. Because what would happen is these were done in duplicate. So there would be one set of books that would be submitted to your state, and then there would be another set of books that would be sent to the federal government. Usually the original books that were handwritten when they went door to door went to the state, and the copies went to the federal government. So sometimes it's worth it, if you can't find somebody in a federal census, to see if you can find a copy of the state copy that was typically kept and given to the state archives, and see if you can find your family listed there. Same thing is going to be true for some of these specialty census, these non-population schedules, to see if maybe they still have copies of those industry census, some of those other censuses that didn't survive on a federal level. Here's an example of a mortality schedule. This one's for Frank Davis of Joliet. This is 1870. So Frank is the third one from the top. Tells me that he was born in New York, that he died the previous August, that he was a painter, and that he was killed by falling off of the derrick. So he had been painting, he had lost his footing, and he had fallen off. The way the mortality schedule was supposed to work, and luckily for us, sometimes it didn't, is that they were looking for anybody who had died within that community in the previous year from the date of the census. So if the census was conducted on April 1st, then they wanted everybody who died from April 1st of 1869 to March 31st of 1870. Sometimes the census taker didn't do that. Sometimes he just did the whole calendar year. So sometimes you'll find people who might have died in February or March or January of 1869 because they either didn't understand the question or they thought, oh, they might as well just record everybody. So sometimes you get people outside of that one calendar year, but it provides the information about who they were, how old they were, what their cause of death was. Sometimes it'll tell you where they're buried. It depends on the particular census year. But these could be really, really useful to you in your research. So if you know somebody died and you don't exactly know how, but they fall into that year, it's worth it to go in and check the mortality schedule to see if they're listed. So slave schedules also can be very hit or miss. I do research in South Carolina, so I have used these from time to time. Sometimes you'll get the individual names of the slaves who were living on the particular plantation. Sometimes you're just getting the name of the plantation owner and the inventory of the people who are living there. So to give you an example, here you look at this and it just gives you the ages, and that they're all males or that they're males and females, but there's no actual names that are provided. So it just depends on the community and the census taker that's recording the data. So if you go to search these schedules and you're not having any luck, try searching by the owner of the plantation to see if they come up listed that way. So state censuses are a lot of fun. We had conducted 2 state censuses in Illinois. They did one in 1885 and they did one in 1865. Those are available on microfilm from the Illinois State Library. Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library has a copy of them. Family Search has a portion of 1855 and 1865. They claim that that census is incomplete. It's not. They have it on microfilm at the State Library or Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library. You can view it. For whatever reason, it's just not complete online for some reason, but it does exist. Unfortunately for Illinois, they were just the head of households with the slash marks. So you don't get every person who's living in the household in 1855 or 1865. You just get the name of the head of the householder, but they can still be useful for providing that gap between the 1860 and the 1870 census. Most state censuses were done on the 5-year mark, typically to fill in that information between the federal census. So they can come in really, really handy, especially for filling in that gap between the 1890 census, which was burned. So if your gap is from 1880 to 1900, you might have 2 state census in there that can fill in those details to make up for that missing federal census. So again, it's worth it. Check the state archives or the state library where you're doing your research. A lot of them have started popping up online. So if you're doing research in New York or Wisconsin or in Iowa, those are already online and they're digitized. They're available in Family Search. They're available in Ancestry, but not all of the years. So not all of the New York State Census years are available online just yet. So, keep in mind it's a process you're going to want to keep checking it back to. Sadly, not all state censuses were conducted. There are plenty of states that didn't have any census at all. Ohio is one of those that never conducted a state census. Texas and Wyoming are a couple of other states that never conducted a state census. One of the handouts I gave you was an inventory to state censuses or territorial censuses. So make sure you download that so you know whether or not there was a census that was done in your state at the time that you're researching. Not all of these are created equal. They can be anywhere from a single postcard size census to a multi-page sheet. So if you have family in Kansas in 1885, it was a 3-page form. If you were in Iowa in 1915, it was a postcard. So it doesn't mean the information's not still important. It just means you might not be getting the same degree or level of data that you would from year to year. Here's an example. This is the Illinois State Census 1865. I had talked about the Murrays, William Murray and his wife Amelia. If you look down the page, the 5th entry down says Widow Murray. And it lists, one boy between the ages of, 5 and 10, 2 boys between the ages of, 15, 10, and 20. So what that tells me right away is that William Murray dies sometime between 1860 and 1865, and his widow Murray is now listed as the head of householder. So women can be represented here. It's not always necessarily just men. Here's an example from Iowa State. This is that postcard I was just referring to, but this one postcard has 8 different pieces of useful information for you. So it gives me his name, it tells me his address, tells me what his occupation is, so I can go looking for employment records, tells me what his religion is, it tells me where he's born, it tells me whether or not he can read and write, it tells me how many years he's been in the United States. So even a little postcard can still provide a tremendous amount of information for you. And it's the only year that Iowa asked what your religious affiliation was, which is really, really useful. Here's Kansas State, again, a multi-page form, or actually no, this is just 2 pages. So it gives me the name of the head of householder, tells me who their family members are, it tells me their age, their physical description, it tells me what their occupation is, it tells me where they were born and where the family is born. So provides a lot of the same data that you would get from the federal census, just in those 5-year increments in between. Now, I'm curious to know if any of you have ever used school census or what they call school schedules before. To me, they're kind of like the holy grail. Today is International Unicorn Day. So to me, school censuses are like the genealogy unicorn because they're not always readily available. They could be really hard to track down and find, but the information provided in them could be the only time that you will ever have any evidence of a particular child being alive at any given time. So for example, in the state of Illinois, Illinois doesn't start recording births and deaths until November of 1877, and then it's not required by law and with enforcement until 1914. But the state of Illinois started the township school system in 1848. So the first school schedules that you find are for 1848. So you have children being listed with ages and with birth dates on occasion 30 years, 40 years before the state starts requiring that information being recorded by law. So if you're doing research, like I do research in Nebraska and Kansas, they didn't start requiring birth certificates until 1910 and 1911, but I have school census records from the 1890s. So these can be a tremendous, useful tool for you in your research, if you can find them. They also recorded all school-aged children up to the age of 21. So even if you were long out of school and employed or married and already had children, you could still show up in a school census because you're under the age of 21. A really fun thing about this is I have a couple of families where I have the mother and the child on the same census page because the mother is 20 and the child is 5 or 4, and they're showing up listed both as school-aged children on the census form. It's a great way to find widows who remarry because it'll show the head of householder by name and then the names of the children. So if the children still have dad's surname, it'll show who the new father-in-law, stepdad is, as well as the name of the children. So that could be useful. It also shows those women who got married under the age of 21, because it'll have them listed underneath their husband, who is listed as head of household. So these can be really fun. They can be really useful. The downside is they can live in a number of different places. So in Illinois, they have some at the Illinois Regional Archives, at the IRAD, as well as at the State Archives in Springfield. In some states, like in Nebraska, they're at the county clerk's office. In Kansas, sometimes they're either with the Regional Board of Education or at the local historical society. So they're not all in one place. It's worth it to kind of investigate and look around and see what you can find. Some of them are starting to pop up online. You'll find some in Family Search, and you'll find some through some other small town historical society and genealogical society collections. So here's an example of one that is online. This is for South Dakota for 1909. Again, it gives the names of the boys and the girls. What's wonderful about these is they're usually done by family group. So you have all of the children from a particular family listed together. So you can see that you've got Goldie Luce and Vern Luce, 7 years old and 6 years old, as well as the categories that they're studying in school. This is one of those that I was referring to. So in the family I'm researching, Mrs. Tabitha Linfield, who's the wife, is listed as, the school-aged child to her husband, Roy Linfield. She's 17 years old, but she's married. So you get the opportunity to see her husband's name there as well. So if you look down a couple entries later, you have Lawrence Lampkin listed, and then Mrs. Emma Mauer, who's listed, who's 18 years old. So, that's her married name, living with her father. So you can get some really good information there. You'll see name changes. So you'll see, like Francis Lennon, and Glenn Lennon. You have the boys and the girls listed by age. So just really, really important pieces of information. Here's another one. This is Frankfort Township. This is Will County. These are at the State Archives in Springfield. This one's 1890s, I believe, but it gives me the names of the boys. It tells me how many days they've been absent. It gives me their ages. Same thing with the girls. It tells me, how many days that they've been in attendance. So you can figure out how many days of school they've missed. Like poor Willie Mankey has only been in school 1 day. Otto Burmeister's only been in school, 2 days, probably because they're working on the farm. And they can only come to class when they don't have farm chores to do. This one's, again, from Saunders County, Nebraska. I had shown you one earlier. This was 1926. They start giving you the actual dates of birth and the age, and then the names of the parents or the head of the household. So you can see that you can get some really, really, really good, useful information out of these. So now in Illinois, the State Archives does have some of them, but there are a tremendous amount of them that live at the regional archives depositories across the state. So there are 7 different IRADs that collect materials on the counties all across the state of Illinois. If you go to the State Archives website, you can get a list of the regional archives depositories, but there's also a page on the IRAD page where you can search by category. So I can go in, and this is what I did on this screenshot, and you have this in your handout. It should be there. But if you go to the State Archives website, you go to the IRAD Center, and I just put in school. And I just wanted to see all the records that would pop up listed under school. And you look for Brown County, Cass County, Coles County, DeKalb County, Lee County, that they have those school schedules, 1924 to 1953, 1891 to 1937, 1906 to 1947. So if you're doing research in the state of Illinois, you could easily find information about your school-aged ancestors in these records. So military censuses and schedules. In Illinois, they did a Civil War military census in 1862. Those are on 26 microfilm reels through the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library. You can view them if you go down there. I have a complete set of them at my library in Plainfield, so I'm happy to look something up for you. If when we get back to work, I can do that for you. You can find a library that might have them like I have them and be able to go and look at them. It's just a single page. There's not a lot of details on it, but what's important, and the reason why they did the Civil War census was because they were looking for men in case of an apparent draft. They weren't sure if they were going to have to start enlisting men into the Union Army at that time. So they wanted an inventory of all of the men who were age appropriate, who were eligible to serve. So it gives you the name of the person, the township that they're living in, their age, their occupation. Sometimes it'll tell you where they're born. That could be really general. It could just say Pennsylvania, or sometimes they took the time to write exactly where they were born, and then whether or not they've already served. So that part's really cool, because if somebody did their 100 days service from April to August of 1861, they might not have been willing to re-up and re-enlist. So they would definitely be sure to say, I already served my 100 days, and provide the unit in the county where they had already served. And that's what you can find on those census. There's different military censuses that are created throughout the US history. There was one that was done for Revolutionary War soldiers. There was another one that was done for War of 1812 soldiers. There was one that was done for First World War soldiers in certain counties. So it just depends. It's worth going out and investigating and just doing some searches to see what you can find. The 1818 pensioners list for Revolutionary War records is the first one. They did another one in the 1840s, and then they did another inventory of pensioners in the 1950s. Ancestry, the collection that they have in Ancestry, is the one that was done in the 1950s. So keep in mind, when you're looking at military census data, the closer you can get to the event, the more accurate the information is going to be. So if you're going to be looking for Revolutionary War pension census or 1812 pension census, you want to be looking in the 19th century. Don't be using the 20th century indexes that were created. Get as close to the original source as you can. A lot of those are already digitized and available through Internet Archive, so you can get a full inventory, print out those books, download them, and save them. They might be more accurate than what you're going to find if you're looking at Ancestry. Same thing for 1840. If you go out to Colonial America through US Roots Web, if you go out to Internet Archive, they've got the original books, whereas what you see in Ancestry is just the index that was based off of secondary materials. The 1890 census, which I mentioned earlier, again, was part of that fire that happened in 1921. So all of the states between Alabama and Kansas were destroyed by fire. So the good news is, if you had family from Kentucky to Wyoming, those records still exist. They've been digitized. They're available online. You can find them. But if you had family in Illinois, or you had family in Arkansas or Alabama, then unfortunately those no longer exist. It's a separate schedule, like I talked about the mortality schedules or the agricultural schedules. So they just have the name of the soldier, they have his rank, they have his unit, they have his dates of service. And in some cases, they recorded what their ailments were, which can be kind of entertaining. But it'll provide that information that you can then pull out of that data to then go looking for military records, to go looking for newspaper accounts about that unit, to go onto databases like Illinois State Archives has, Illinois Civil War muster rolls, and you can go looking for that data based on what you can find from the veterans schedule. They also asked veterans questions on the 1930 census, and they also asked it in the 1940 census. The downside to the 1940 census is the fact that they only asked slot number 14 and slot number 37, I think, on the census, whether or not they had served in the military. In the 1930 census, they asked everybody. So there's a category off to the side, I'll show you that in just a second, that asks, if you were a veteran, what war did you serve in? So for 1930, most of what you're going to see is WW, but you will see SPAM for Spanish-American War. Sometimes you'll see Civ written in for Civil War. So they will provide that in the columns off to the side. National Archives put together a really nice inventory of military census. Their Civil War one list is linked here for you. You could easily take a look at the information they provided. I was talking about those pensioners that were done in the 1818 and 1840s. These are available through Internet Archives. You can download these whole series of books. So you can kind of see, like for Adams County, Illinois didn't exist, obviously, during the Revolutionary War. These are done by state. So where they are living in 1818, where they are living in 1840 is where you're going to find them. So that's the caveat. If they came to Illinois at some point, and you never knew that they left South Carolina, you might have a harder time tracking them down. But it's done by the state where they're living at the time that the census is conducted. So in Illinois, by county, we have an inventory of those men who had served during the Revolutionary War. It doesn't tell us where, but at least it provides you the information that they had served. Here's that Illinois military census. This one's for Manhattan Township in Will County. Again, sometimes you just get the state. They don't always tell you where, like Germany. Germany didn't actually exist at this time, so it's interesting that it's just listed as Germany, but it gives you that these are all farmers, and then it shows you the 2 men at the bottom who had already served, that they had volunteered in the Illinois regiments for their 100 days already. Here's that 1890 federal census I was talking about. So James Craig, who's my guy, tells me that he was a private, you know, that he was in Company A, that he had served in the 2nd Volunteers, that his dates of service were 1862 to 1864. It looks like 6, but it's not, because it tells me how many months. He served active duty for 11 months. And it provides that data that I can then go using, whether in the National Archives or through other sources, to track him down. That 1930 census that I mentioned, there's that category asking if you had served any type of military service. You can see off to the side, World War, World War, World War. It's telling me that yes, these men had served, and they had served in the First World War. Again, by the time you get to 1940, they're only asking 2 people on a page whether or not they had served any type of military service or if their parents had served. So we can see from the example that they give at the bottom of the page, you know, yes, one of them had served in the First World War, the other one, no. They had nobody in their family who had previously served. So where am I going to look online? Ancestry has records. Fold 3 has records. Those are both by subscription. Same thing with World Vital Records. They're by subscription, so you would have to pay to get access to those. They do have them in Ancestry Library Edition. So if your library was lucky enough, like mine, to get access from home, you can do it now, so you can get back into the library. There's plenty of places to get free information out there as well. So Heritage Quest, you could usually get into with your library card. The National Archives has records available for looking for military and census data as well. So now Native American censuses are kind of unique because not everybody needs to use them, but if you're lucky enough that you have Native American ancestry, or if you had family who had lived or worked on reservations, then they have the opportunity to show up in these records as well. The downside to using Native American records is the fact that the records were only as good as the Indian agent who was recording the data. So before 1884, it can be really spotty. They didn't necessarily have to collect that data. It would really just be, you know, the Indian Affairs agents who were on the ball, who were keeping inventories of who was living on the reservations at that particular time. From 1884 to the 1930s, it's usually a fairly decent collection of census data that's available for you to research ancestors. Vast majority of these are available through the regional archives across the United States. So for the Midwest, so for Illinois, Michigan, Minnesota, Indiana, Wisconsin, they're at the regional archives in Chicago on Pulaski. If you were doing research in the Southwest, then they'll be in Arizona. If you're doing research, you know, in Kansas, Nebraska, Oklahoma, Texas, they're going to be in Oklahoma, but they are available for you in your research. So here's an example of one that is digitized and made available through the National Archives at Great Lakes. So it gives me the names of the heads of the households as well as the people who are living within that family. They also gave each family an individual number. So throughout the course of their records, so whether it's births being recorded, deaths being recorded, yearly census data that's being recorded, they put in that number. So if you can find the number of the family listed on one of the census rolls, you can then go to the family books that they would keep by reservation, by tribe, look by number, because you now have the number off of the census data, and be able to pull up additional information about that family. And they could be really, really rewarding. Sometimes they'll list people who had passed away. So they're doing the census inventory and they're listing the people who are still living, but then they'll put annotations in about children who died or spouses or parents who had died that get written right into the record. So they're actually really, really cool records. Here's another example. This one's done online. It's available through Family Search. But again, you look at this record, you know, it gives the Native American name, it gives the Anglicanized name, it tells me how they're related to that particular person. And you even see James, Matthew, and Elsie had already passed away, but they're still being represented on this particular census. The family is still including them in their count as family members. Family Search has a lot of Native American census that were done in book form. So if you go into the catalog, so if you go in at the top where it says search, and it'll show you wiki, it'll show you databases, it'll show you catalog, and it'll show you books. I would go in and search the books, and I would go in and search the catalog by tribe or agency and see if you can pull some of these up as well. They're not all available in the database collection, so you want to investigate by looking at either the books or the catalog to see what else you can find. Here's an example of one. This one has the good girl on it. That was her Anglicanized Native American name, and that's how she is indexed in the census, is as the good girl. Dawes rolls and applications, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on because they're widely available. They're available through National Archives. They're available through Fold 3. But one way you can use the Dawes rolls, which is only the 5 civilized tribes, so it's not going to include things like Potawatomi. It's not going to include things like the Menominee, like we saw. So they're very limited in scope, and only 60% of those that applied were actually granted status through the federal government. So only 40% of people who represent these tribes are represented in the Dawes rolls, so they're woefully incomplete. But you can use the Bureau of Land Management records to see if they were approved, because if you find them in the Dawes rolls, they would have been entitled to land. I can then go into the Bureau of Land Management, search on them by name to see if they truly were awarded the land that they were promised. So those two things work hand in hand pretty well. The census card cover sometimes has more information on it than the Dawes roll application itself. So that would be when they wrapped up the packet to fold it away. If somebody had changed their status or was born or died, they would write it right on the jacket, the application jacket. So they're not always digitized. So sometimes you might want to request it from the National Archives because Fold 3 might not have digitized it. Again, you can go into Fold 3. They've got the Indian census rolls in there. Again, most of these are Dawes rolls, but you will find some for other communities listed in there as well as in Family Search. And then if you find them in the Dawes rolls, you can go into the Bureau of Land Management. If you click under miscellaneous, you can choose your category. So you can choose Indian fee patents or Indian allotments and see if that family member actually received that land from the federal government. Places where you can find Native American census is online. You can get it from census.gov. You can get it from Ancestry, Archives, the National Archives, Internet Archives, Census Finder. So there are a variety of places where you can dig deeper into Native American census as well. So places to go online, you have this in your handout, just some, when you have exhausted all of the major places where you're going to look for information, here are some additional resources just to check and play around with to see if maybe you can find some additional information. Take a look at Family Search's wiki, take a look at the US census page provided by census.gov. There might be some more links and hints for you. Don't underestimate the importance of books. By all means, there are some great census guides and handbooks out there. Anne Lanehart's book, State Census Records, is out of print, so you might have to find it through interlibrary loan from your library. William Thorndale's Book of Maps is available in Heritage Quest. That's what they digitized when they put that collection up. But the print book is always really useful to look at as well. And then I will answer questions, Amy, if you have any. This is one of my favorites, one of those lucky finds that you find when you're doing research. And the Joliet Signal reran this. This was picked up by the AP, so it ran in almost every newspaper across the country. But it was those weird, fun census questions that they wanted to see on the census. So they have things like, how many empty bottles do you have in the house? During quarantine, I'm not going to ask you guys that right now. You know, do you use tobacco? You know, do your kids look like you? You know, just some really fun, it's in your handout, take a look at it. It's just really entertaining, the types of questions they ask. You know, which food do you prefer, rum or mixed drinks? So they poked some fun at the census all the way back in 1860.
I love that. And we have had a couple of questions come in. I just want to remind our attendees that if you have any questions for Tina, just write them into the chat and I will speak them out. So the first question that we have is, are school records you mentioned for public schools and not necessarily private schools?
Yes, so they would be public school inventories. Sometimes you would have Catholic schools, movement schools, Presbyterian schools who would do their own schedules, but they were mandated by the state. So the state set up what they called the one schoolhouse system, which was the township schools in 1848. Those were the ones that needed to have a minimum of 10 students in order for the school to be active and be funded. So they needed to do census schedules to make sure that there were 10 children to make sure that school would receive funding. Private schools were separate.
Tina, we had a little issue with your audio on that one. I'm just going to mute and then start you over. Hopefully that'll work. Um,
Now?
it's kind of, it's distorted. It's a little weird sounding.
Sorry about that.
Oh, that's okay. I'm glad it's only happening at the end.
Hopefully you'll catch the important part.
Yeah, maybe sometimes on the recording it comes through clearly. And Tony says, welcome to our new world. Yes, Tony, our new motto at the Glen Ellyn Public Library is 10 years of change in 2 weeks. So that's what we're doing right now. A couple more questions. Tony had an observation for Native American names. I cannot imagine how the long format of that person's name would be entered into any record under a first name, surname identification that we're used to. And I wondered if you could tell us if you think that Native American names had been butchered during census taking.
So if you go back and find the Native American census, they're going to give you both. So they're going to give, if you right on the right, the English name, first name, last name. And it's last name, comma, first name. If you look at the Native American name on the left, there's not a separation. It's just the name. So you're not getting the first and last name in that particular category. So you have to cut it around it. So if you only know the Native American name, but you don't know necessarily the English name, then try it a number of ways. Try it all together, surname, split it up with first and last name. Sometimes it's better to just search by location, first name. So if you know that the first name was Mary, Peter, sometimes I might go into Heritage, for example, and I might put in Peter and the community date and just look at the whole to see if I can find it or spot it, because it might have absolutely butchered. So sometimes I might not even bother to try to figure out surname versus given name. I just might put it in and see what comes up.
Great. I think that's all of our questions, unless anybody has anything that they want to ask left over.
I gave you some good tips and some ideas.
Yeah, thank you so much, Tina. I will say that this is one of our many census programs that we have planned for this spring. Of course, the online response deadline has been moved to August, but we are encouraging our communities to respond as soon as you get them, because a fair count is really, really important. It determines your representation in Congress. It determines how much federal funding we get in the state of Illinois, and we're estimating that somewhere between $1,500 and $1,800 per person per year that we miss in Illinois is what's at stake. So up to $18,000 per person that we miss over 10 years, which is just wild. And so we're so grateful to Tina for telling us a little bit about why we use the census and why it's so important, and something that maybe your descendants 72 years from now will look for you on the census information that is released this year. So thank you very much. We will be posting this on social media. We, of course, will be welcoming Tina back in the future. We love having you at the library, and everybody have a great day.